So it's a great pleasure to now to launch into the last panel of the day. We just spoke about tech, how tech manipulates information, the importance of us understanding, how that works, and then hopefully this one was about how journalists then clarify all that for us. So climate journalism and public interest communications remain essential for helping people make sense of the accelerating climate crisis and for enabling informed public engagement. But as the media landscape fractures and digital platforms reshape what is seen, amplified, and trusted, these fields are under increasing pressure. So this panel will explore the challenges of climate journalism in remaining accessible, trusted, and resilient amid ongoing disruption and change. That's a tall order, Campbell. So I'm very pleased to have as a moderator for this panel, Campbell Clark. He's the chief political writer for the Globe and Mail. And we have virtually Eva Morel, Secretary General of QuotaClimat. I'm hoping she pops up. And then Nicole Mortillaro, she's the senior reporter for science with the CBC. Chris Russell has been with us from the beginning of this work program. We have associate professor at Carleton, and of course from Re.Climate. And then from Les Connecteurs, who's also our videographer for the day, Chloé-Anne Touma. So in your good hands, Campbell, to take it from here.
All right, thank you very much, Jennifer. So again, I'm Campbell Clark. I'm a political columnist, and so misinformation is something I'm pretty familiar with. It sometimes feels like the water I swim in, so it's been nice to sort of listen to people talk about, ways to do something about it. I think probably most of you know the sort of broad context about the media and misinformation in the last few years. Journalism used to be a big part of the sources of information, the biggest part of sources of information people got on an everyday basis. And that's changed in recent years. It's changed because of social media, of interactive media in particular. It's also changed because the sort of scale of journalism is shrinking in terms of news gathering. And in terms of climate misinformation and misinformation generally, it raises a lot of questions for how we deal with it. Is it our job to counter it? Is it our responsibility to counter it? Can we even do that? Is it even possible? Fact-checking is often raised as one way that journalists should be doing that, but sometimes it's a bit of an effort to keep up with the fire hose of misinformation. Maybe it takes different types of storytelling. So we're going to look at some of those questions today. We're hoping to do that with a bit of a conversation here, but we're going to, and then we're going to have questions at the end, hopefully a lot of questions. But we're going to start with turning it over to Eva Morel, who's joining us virtually, because I think she's going to talk a little bit about QuotaClimat and what it does. So Eva, if you would start that, and then we'll bring it back to start the conversation with Chris.
Hello everyone, bonjour tout le monde. Really happy to be joining you by distance today. So my name is Eva Morel. I co-founded the NGO QuotaClimat, which is French-based. So this is why I can't be joining you today in presence. But I'm actually in New York for the Climate Week, so very, very nearby. QuotaClimat is a French NGO that works on improving the climate media coverage, and we are a member of the Climate Action Against Disinformation Network. I believe some of the CAD members are here in the room, so hello to CAD members. What we work on is that we noticed a surge of climate disinformation in news media specifically. And the reason why we believe that news media are crucial is because they shape perceptions and willingness to act, but they also target specifically decision makers. Our view is that the evolution of the information landscape is profound, but even though online platforms are becoming increasingly influential in our daily lives, traditional media like TV, radio, and the press still play a crucial role in setting the agenda. So they hold real performative power when it comes to politics and economic decisions specifically. Climate disinformation has a proven measurable impact on decision makers specifically, and this has been recently proven scientifically. And traditional media remains one of the main sources that decision makers rely on to gauge public opinion. Research also shows that decision makers' perception of public opinion is often off by an average of 15 percentage points. They tend to overestimate conservative views and underestimate progressive views, especially when it comes to climate change. So given the state of the media ecosystem in Europe and in France specifically, we believe that a mix of approaches are needed to tackle climate disinformation, being incentives, also journalistic training, of course, media monitoring, and I'll talk a bit about that later, but we are developing a tool that automatically detects climate disinformation in news media in several countries now. And we also need, and that will be my last point, regulatory tools. One of our major recent victories in France is that we obtained the first financial penalty for a case of climate disinformation that was uncontradicted on specific TV channels, which is called CNews, which is our very own French folk news. And it was the first time that our independent media regulator, the ARCOM, emitted such a sanction. So we hope that we can expand this approach to other cases to put an end to the phenomenon in the most trusted source of information. Very happy to be with you by distance today again.
All right, thank you, Eva. So what we're going to try to do is kick off a conversation, but we're because it's a very broad subject, I was going to ask Chris to talk about some of the work that he's done. There's a report he'll tell you about called Flame Wars, and we thought that would give a sort of some specifics we could work around, or at least a case that we could work around. So I'm going to throw it over to you, Chris, to start us off.
Thank you. And just to remind everyone, I'm not a journalist, but I'm very happy to be surrounded by journalists here today. And I work in a School of Journalism and Communication, so I'm surrounded by journalists there. And I think it's really important that this panel has been programmed in the context of a disinformation conversation where a lot of the solutions sometimes talk about state-led or tech-led solutions. So I'm glad that we're foregrounding this. I'm interested in the circulation of false, misleading, and manipulative communication during events, emergencies, crises that are associated with climate impacts, especially during wildfire seasons. We started with this work in 2023. You probably remember that was a pretty devastating season in terms of severity, intensity, and impacts, and the online space is filled with all manner of confusing, frustrating, hateful content. We now have 3 seasons to kind of look back on and assess what happened, and one thing we can't say is that mis and disinformation and conspiracy were a function of the severity of those fires or the surprise of the season. That wasn't the case because we see all the same content, we still have the same drivers and dynamics underpinning it, and in some ways the situation is worse today, I would say. So how is it worse? What happened? I'm just going to spill some stuff that's been happening into the conversation, and we'll see if it's something we want to talk about. So lots of conflicting, confusing, misleading information about the nature of the fires, the status of firefighting and emergency services, the role and responsibilities of government, people just not sure whether, when, how to assess risk or to evacuate, and getting conflicting information about what to do if they decide to evacuate. AI images that even experts and people running fire crews in the areas that the images are of, not knowing if they're false, exaggerated, wrong, fabricated, or AI generated. Arson, so much arson explanations out there, completely exaggerated and out of proportion with the incidence of arson itself, yet this content's boosted often by political elites that want an explanation to hold other than climate change. If you remember this letter that came from US politicians concerned about Canadian mismanagement of forests and the wildfires affecting the public health of their populations in the Midwest, concerned about arson and the inability to control arson. This is a pretty serious issue when you remember that that letter also came with a reminder that our sovereignty comes with responsibilities. I don't think that's a lecture we want to get to the end of. Weather modification, climate control, geoengineering explanations for fires suggesting that they're unnatural due to experimentation and manipulation. First glance, this looks good. People are connecting wildfires to climate. Unfortunately, they're connecting climate to state-run geoengineering projects from the mid-20th century. Completely false. You're probably not going to rest well when I tell you this weekend that there's a subcommittee in the US that's looking into this, led by Marjorie Taylor Greene. We'll see what she comes up with. Planned crisis conspiracies, claims that the Canadian government itself is setting these fires as acts of state terrorism to depopulate rural regions, to force people into cities, to gin up fears for the Liberals' climate policy. So earlier this year, after the election, not long after the election, BC Wildfire Service had a 2-week surge of this kind of planned crisis conspiratorial content on their Facebook page. Engagement levels they have not seen, certainly when there's no fires, and engagement at the levels of kind of peak engagement when there are serious fires in that place. Now, why is disinformation around wildfires, disinformation around climate conspiracies post-election targeting BC Wildfire Service? I don't know. It was an election where it was said that if the Liberals formed the government, it could be the end of Canada. There's a whole host of political things we could take account of, but they don't know. I don't know. Meta doesn't seem to care much about what's happening there. But I can say climate conspiracies and the turn that the conversation has taken really started with climate misinformation in the election from 2021. And that's when the conversation I think took a bit of a turn. As well, some enterprising people have taken the updates and posts and comments from BC Wildfire Service, run them through an AI, created news stories out of them that are exaggerated and dramatic to generate clicks. These stories can circulate on Facebook as news. Journalists that actually cover these comments and updates cannot have their stories on Facebook due to the news ban. So that's a lovely outcome of the situation we're in. Just a couple more, is that all right? Yeah. AI summaries of lawful orders. So lawful orders are when wildfire services and emergency management say no access to the parks, no campfires, you have to evacuate. The AI summaries, they're wrong. They're inaccurate. People are getting the wrong information going into these spaces, and law enforcement then has to have, or officials have to have, uncomfortable conversations with them. People don't love this, right? People don't love having manipulated, misleading information, feel they've misled. They don't like sitting in those feelings when they're starting to think about whether government is exaggerating the threats to keep them out of these spaces. And I can tell you that the conversation around this is very familiar to the conversation that was happening around public health and COVID. The idea that exaggerated threats are the way in which an authoritarian government is taking away access to things people prize. And so I think this one in particular is a particularly unwelcome phenomena that we're dealing with, and is kind of directly related to our inability to sort through the AI question. So I'll stop there. I know you probably need a professor to come tell you that there's lies on the internet, but I think it's worth having a couple examples, and maybe we can talk about what the effects of that are and some solutions.
But what I think is interesting in what Chris was saying is that, like, when he mentioned the fact that the media, so us, were censored on platforms like Facebook, and I saw, like, some people are laughing, but I was doing interviews the other side, and, like, there were people who were like, oh, really? I didn't notice. So the fact that so many people are still not aware that for something like 2 years, the actual verified information has not been on their feed is like worrisome to me. And that's something that I worry about.
Should be more worrisome to me, I think. But there were stories about wildfire misinformation in 2023. I went back and read some that talked about, people are claiming it's laser beams and arsonists. So, Chris, was that not good enough? Was that not going to turn back the misinformation? And, did you draw any conclusions about what could have been done better here? How this information environment could have been improved?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't good enough. I think actually mainstream media, given how so surprising that story was, did a relatively good job with that. But those stories, again, were just not circulating in social media platforms that people use. So Facebook used by most Canadians. Canadians that use them get most of their political news from that platform. As Chloe mentioned, they don't know the fact that journalism's kind of been cut out of that feed or that flow of information. And so that's an example where the journalism's not just circulating in these spaces. There's a wider conversation about the way in which those stories assume a certain position and way of trying to communicate fact-checking that I think lessens the way people engage with it. Some people don't always love, I'll be very brief with this, but I have young children. I'm very blessed that they do not like sports, but unfortunately they like people that like sports. And sometimes we go to these kids' games. And I got to tell you, the most vitriol goes to the referee in these sporting events, right? They don't like referees, people don't like hall monitors, and so I think there is a way we need to think about fact-checking in a different way that doesn't evoke some of those feelings in people, but that also lets those fact checks circulate more widely and brings them into better conversations, not just kind of stopping the conversation by saying, you're wrong, here's the reality, on with your day.
I wanted to add to Chloe's point too. It's not just Facebook, but now we have TikTok to worry about, and I know like older people who take that as news, and that's what they believe, and to me that's really concerning. When, like you said, we can't put our stories on Facebook, and then people like, CBC, we have a TikTok channel, and we do our best, obviously, to get that information to Canadians because it's so important, including the wildfire. That is actually one of our mandates, is getting accurate information during wildfire season to the communities that need it. But yeah, it is concerning that that we kind of cannot, we're limited in what we can share. And it is problematic. And it is, I'm surprised people don't know.
And especially in Quebec, obviously this is where I come from, but Les Connecteurs is a Montreal-based media outlet, and we're at the crossroads of traditional media and everything, but also new media, new type of media. So you mentioned TikTok. We're on TikTok now because we have to be, right? So what we do is we have podcasts, and our page flipping magazine is like somewhat you would see in Harry Potter, where pages are moving because we have our podcasts there, and we try to make all the content converge in one place, but also we'll have it posted elsewhere so that we can reach a variety of audiences. And I feel like we have to reinvent ourselves. So the other thing, when it comes to education, I feel there's like this, because we try to bridge the gap between communities, whether it's science and researchers and general public, so that they get that what they're doing is actually positive and can have a good impact on their lives. But when it comes to education, I feel like the narratives they're teaching, that are being taught to whether aspiring or working journalists are not quite aligned with our actual market and realities. I feel like it's dated. When they say, okay, absolute neutrality is the thing now. Well, it's not anymore. Who's neutral? Who's fully neutral? Who's funding the media now? No one wants to fund it. So we go get it where we can. And that means you cannot be fully neutral.
I'm going to see if I can pick up on something that Chris said about fact-checking. And Nicole, I won't ask you to answer for the whole CBC, but you're talking about how one of your mandates is information about wildfires. I'm sure people around you have done fact-checking on that. Explainers, do you think it counters the misinformation? Do you think it is effective? Does it meet the social responsibility the CBC is supposed to have?
We. The Globe and Mail. Yeah. Hey. No, it's I've written explainers, for example, about wildfires. Mm-hmm. We rely on government sources, on the IFFC. Yeah. We rely on the provincial governments and the provincial fire agencies. So we are committed to getting those facts out there, and we get a really good response. Like, there are a lot of people on those pages, and sometimes what we will do too is say, oh, you may have heard blank, but this is actually what's going on. And often we stress, please look to your local fire agency to get accurate information. So I think we are doing a good job of that, if I may say so myself. But it's still a challenge because, again, it's social media, because people are on social media looking at those manipulated images. And we did a story on one of those, and we say, like, and actually I think was it, I can't remember, was this year or the 2023, where they said, yeah, these images, we couldn't tell the difference. Or somebody would manipulate the flame so that it would be jumping over the road. And so it's difficult, but we do our best to get it from trusted sources.
Yeah. One of the things I was trying to ask about is the idea that people respond negatively to fact-checking. And one of the previous panels had somebody from the health sector who talked about motivational interviewing being a way of sort of breaking down people's resistance. And journalists don't do this. We can't really do it. It's not as interactive, right? I write about politics. I remember the 2021 election. I remember the sort of the pandemic protests throughout the election campaign. There are definitely groups that base their identity around certain beliefs, political or otherwise, and it's hard they see that as part of their identity, and it's hard to break that down with facts. So my point is simply that it's very difficult for fact-checking to necessarily change people's minds once they've attached that identity.
I was just going to say, that is one of the things that, I do a lot of reading about, because how to approach people who might be resistant to hearing the facts. And I'm going to kind of veer a little bit over here, but one of the things that we've done at the CBC too is, like, I always joke that I'm the doom and gloom climate change reporter, because I'm always talking about the science and, it's the world's, hottest year, or the oceans and all that. And then my colleague, Emily Chung, she writes solutions-based pieces. And we get such good feedback from that. And I've read a study that talked about that, how presenting the public with solutions may kind of tamper down that resistance.
We've left you out a bit, Eva, but we've been talking about what needs to be done in journalism. You obviously have some views, because that's what your organization talks about. Do you think that this is you mentioned regulation for misinformation. Do you think that there are sort of stronger methods to be used in terms of controlling misinformation than, fact-checking? You obviously believe in some sort of state response.
Well, independent state response, of course, because, when it comes to independent journalism, it's complicated to involve the state. I would say that fact-checking is, of course, needed. But one thing that we observe, and it is specifically for the TV and radio, not really for the press, is that, for example, during electoral campaigns, or when political decision makers are invited for interviews, the contradiction is very low, very poor when it comes to climate change, when they express their opinion on facts that are verified and that are not, in fact, opinions, that are scientific truths. And what is demonstrated also by the science is that when you have live contradiction that is quite strong, it really have a significant impact on the way the audience reacts to the false narrative. And so what we advocate for with the French media specifically that we know best is to have live contradiction on the most frequent narratives of disinformation. And we've identified 30 of them on the French parameter, meaning that it would just require of course, it's a lot of work, but it would require to know the 30 most frequent claims of disinformation to be able to contradict live those claims. And they are coming from the usual suspects, meaning that in France, for example, the far right concentrates the majority of claims that are false regarding climate change, the conservative right as well. So we expect them to spread such narratives. And at the moment, the contradiction is very low. So we, of course, believe that regulatory mechanisms are effective, but first and foremost, to avoid having too much regulation, because, of course, when we talk about independent journalism, it's really dangerous to talk a lot about regulation. Such actions would be required. I would just end by saying that, of course, some media are voluntary in terms of contradicting climate disinformation. Some of them, and I speak again about the French parameter that I know best, are really spreaders of disinformation. And we talked about the financial difficulties of some of the media. In France, most of them are being acquired at the moment, the private media, by a few billionaires which are very vocal about their ideological agenda behind the fact that they acquire some media. And 4 media at the moment are concentrating the majority of cases of climate disinformation. And it is not it is not a hazard. We know why they are doing such a thing. And so for them, of course, voluntary actions are not expected because they don't really want to act on anything. So this is why the ARCOM, the media regulator, acts on specific cases. And it has proven to be quite effective in deterring, some of the most strong cases of disinformation. So this is why we believe in this complementary approach.
Can I bounce back on it? And going back to what you were saying about fact-checking, which is hard to reinforce because people have lost trust in their institutions, in the media, in science. Ever since the pandemic, it got worse. And it's like, so even if you want to do fact-checking, you're categorized because in America we're in a very, it's like such a polarized context, politically speaking. So how do you want to it's like people have to choose sides all the time. So how do you reinforce the idea that the media landscape is diverse, that it's not the same narrative all the time? Because I think it's important to diversify your sources of information, and people who dismiss climate change facts will usually listen to 1 or 2 individuals who are influencers, who have lots of have a strong voice and lots of power, and it's hard to overpower that because algorithms will push for their reels and stories and the same type of content over and over. And what can you do in that landscape, which is changing, and like so many small media, specialized media like ours? I mean, the CBC is doing a great job because you have dedicated journalists. But when you're a specialist media with less resources and you want to go on the field, it's your expertise, and you want to talk to the right experts, you don't have the resources to be everywhere, to be on the ground. But you're supposed to be the voice of, okay, well, what's if I want to get more information or a different narrative, or have not listened to the same thing like Eva was saying, which is usually dominant and over you hear the same thing on mainstream media sometimes, you cannot be there and show up because you don't have the resources. And that's hard. So how do you keep the landscape diverse, and how do you rebuild that trust with the general public? Difficult.
I just wanted to add to what you were saying. It's also, so the fact-checking, it's also difficult when you have players who are manipulating the data. So I saw, for example, the hockey stick graph, showing the increase in global temperatures. And, it's a clear trend. And someone had posted or tweeted on Twitter, oh no, and they just put a straight line through it. And they say, see, there's no global warming, there hasn't been any. And it's really difficult when you have people like that out there who are misrepresenting the facts.
But that's just the way it is now, right? No, I mean, that's true.
No, it's true.
Are they actually changing opinion, or are they a fringe? So, Chris, you mapped out some of this, right? Do you feel that when people were spreading misinformation on wildfires, that they were reinforcing opinions or changing opinions? Was misinformation moving, do you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth remembering that we're in a moment of profound information disorder.
Yes.
Right? Like Twitter died. That was a place journalists used to use to connect people, make connections, get updates. Just before the wildfire seasons we've had the last 3 years, Facebook took news off the platform, as we've talked about. That's something we should probably think a little bit more about as we go into TikTok and some of these other platforms, some of them which have are willing to reflect the priorities of the U.S. state. We'll see what happens to TikTok. And so being dependent on these places to connect with other Canadians and lead the conversation is something I think we need to be careful about. But it's a bit of a mess as we're talking about. when a couple academics tried to do a meta-analysis of disinformation solutions, the first one, they had 10, and the first one they listed was local journalism. So what we see with a lot of the things we're talking about is they're much more effective if they come from a local journalist. And a local journalist can do this kind of work, but journalism is not just fact-checking, right? So now I'm going to explain your jobs to you, but it's not just, right? It's not,
I've been trying to lead you there. It's about time.
yeah, it's not fact-check. Like, that's a piece of what's done, but timely, accurate, local knowledge, people want that. Local journalism provides that. These are the ways in which we tell our stories to each other and see our experiences reflected in the news and connect to our communities. When you eviscerate local journalism and that's gone, that erodes the infrastructure that's necessary to be able to operate in these crises and emergency situations. And they're intermediaries, right? A lot of what I've learned has not been by working with network scientists. It's by talking with journalists about this stuff. They connect to other people. When you take those intermediaries out of the loop and imagine someone can just adjust the engagement dials in an office of Facebook, you've got the wrong conception of the problem we're trying to deal with. And so I think trying to restore that broad conception of journalism is crucial.
Just to sort of mention the connection here, local journalism didn't die because there were no readers. It died because they've lost advertising.
Yes.
The Bill C-18, which took news off of Facebook and Meta, was supposed to be a way of forcing Facebook and Meta and digital companies to pay for journalism, and Meta decided to do without. Anyway, I just thought I would make that connection. Those two things are not unrelated.
Completely related. If I could even just add to that, what Meta did when that regulation was happening was they said, we're going to design a product to take these voices out of our feeds, right?
Yes.
And they did that by experimenting on a segment of the Canadian population during the wildfires to see if it would be possible. I couldn't get ethics approval to do that, and then liked what they saw and did it. So I think this is actually, like, when you think, we're having a big conversation now about what's happening as media companies are removing late night news comedies out of the media ecosystem. We had a foreign company remove new Canadian journalism completely out of one of the most used platforms that operate during a time of wildfire crisis. I think that, imagine Justin Trudeau or Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah, I understand why you're upset, except that the point of them doing that was to show that they cannot be regulated. But anyway, so there's a problem there, if you know what I mean. You wanted to add something.
Well, I was just like thinking when you were reminding us of what our jobs were. Thank you for that. but honestly, but it's true. I mean, like, we are going towards something called solutions journalism, and that means drawing connections. And when I said the narratives and the what we teach you in schools, or like to aspiring journalists and working journalists, is outdated, it is, because they don't teach you that. And I've had editors-in-chief who would tell me, well, you're not an intellectual, all you have to do is report facts. And I don't think that's true. I think we have to, like, go above that and raise above and come up with, and we're not the experts, that makes sense. Like, we're supposed to be the voice of the population that wants to know more, wants to be involved, wants to be part of the discussion, to guide innovation, to guide research into, something that's going to be good for the collectivity. And I feel like that's what's missing. So,
are you talking about advocacy journalism, for an example, for climate change? You are. Of
course. And we try, very humbling to see what everyone else does, and we're trying to bridge that gap and make sure that everyone has a say in how funding goes to science, and that's great. I mean, we need innovation research, but what's the purpose? What's in it for them? What's in it for the people? And that's what we're trying to get to. And I think that means, thinking of including as many voices as possible. And that's what we try to do with our the writers as well, who write columns, who are experts from a variety of field, an incredible range of field. We have as many, we have like executives from tech companies, but also from nonprofit who work in culture, about, who try to promote diversity, and they have their say in how technology is changing the social dynamics amongst their organization. So I think it's like having that conversation, but also drawing the right connections.
Is there a risk to advocacy journalism too? Because, the first speaker who was here this morning, who I missed, there's a video online of her speaking, Catherine Hayhoe, and sorry, I'll get to her in a second. And she has a video talking about when she gave her first lecture on science communication and climate communication in Texas, and the first question she was asked was, "Are you a Democrat?" And there is an issue about whether you can be received credibly if you're viewed as being an advocacy journalist. But I think Eva wants to jump in here, and I've been ignoring you. I apologize.
No worries. No, I just wanted to dwell on what's being said on the importance of producing information on the environment before contradicting misinformation and disinformation. Yeah. At the moment in France, environmental issues occupy approximately 3% of airtime on TV and radio. And it's important to say that this share of airtime dedicated to environment is decreasing over time. So we have a structural lack of information. And so before we even talk about disinformation and countering those, it would be great to talk about how newsrooms can produce more information on climate change. That being said, regarding advocacy journalism, it is true that it's complicated for journalists to cover such subjects without having this reputation. But at the same time, it's also instrumentalized by journalists and also just advocacy that are opposed to the environmental transition to say that covering the science, the climate science, is being an advocate. And at the moment, in France, we have this huge battle to reform the way public TV and radio is being structured by our Ministry of Culture. And this very argument is being used to say that covering climate change is a proof that the public audiovisual sector is biased, and this is why we should reform it. And so we have this huge reform that is meant to suppress some programs that talk about climate change. We have this huge program every day that's called La Terre au Carré, which lasts an hour on public radio. And next year it's being replaced by something on history, because covering climate change is portrayed as being an advocate. So I think it's also important to say that covering climate science isn't being an advocate of anything. It's just covering what's related to our everyday life, and also to the economic sector, education sector, etc. And to be aware that we should also maybe combat this very term of advocacy when it comes to covering climate change.
Nicole, you must have to deal with that question quite a bit, no?
Yeah, even internally sometimes it's, oh, is this advocacy? And we have to have the argument to say, well, this is the facts. Just, this is exactly what is happening, and we are presenting this. I'll tell a quick little story. Before I came to the CBC, I was somewhere else, and I wrote about it was the Arctic, and this was 2013, and my story went up, and then it got pulled. And I said to the higher-ups, why is it pulled? And they said that I hadn't given it a fair voice to the oil and gas companies. I was livid, and they did put it back up with me adding one sentence or something, and it was really frustrating. But we've come so far since then, when it was the 97% of scientists agree about global warming and climate change. So it's funny, because I was thinking about this advocacy, and I was like, it is a thin line, I think, to some people. But when you're talking about, for example, that governments or something that needs to be done, they're not meeting their climate targets, etc. You're not supposed to have any skin in the game, but really we all have skin in the game.
All right, I think we're just about ready to take some questions if anyone wants to ask one, because I think we've got lots of things we haven't really touched on, but maybe you could help us touch on them. So we already have one. So why don't you go first?
Hi there. I was kind of surprised to hear you, several of you, make the statement that fact-checking is kind of pointless, almost, doesn't work. I've been working on a paper for the last 3 months about the necessity of supporting fact-checking infrastructure. There was a really interesting study by MIT last year that showed even people who say they don't trust fact-checking are far less likely to share a post that has a fact-checking label on it. They had some interesting explanations for that, like maybe that's not really their genuine belief, they're just spouting the party line. Taiwan, Finland, they've invested deeply in fact-checking and media monitoring infrastructure, partnering with media for debunking and pre-bunking. So I guess I just want to make the point that we shouldn't give up on fact-checking and we shouldn't diminish its importance.
And we're not giving up, or else we wouldn't be sitting here.
Right.
I think, we believe in fact-checking and we believe in what we do, but we know there's a bunch of people out there who don't and who hate on us every single day because they say, well, you're the voice of the government or you're the voice of this group. And it's just really hard to find a way to rebuild that trust. But what you're doing is essential, and I firmly believe that.
Oh, it's not me that's doing it. I'm just researching it. But
Yeah.
the last few studies I've seen from Stats Canada and the DIAS are showing that most Canadians do try to fact check. They don't necessarily have confidence in their ability to do so, but they would like to see more of it. So I think those voices, we heard this morning about these niche voices being artificially amplified. I think the fact-checking naysayers fall into that category.
So I think that's a good point, but the other point is fact-checking enough, right? And certainly for journalists who are dealing with these issues, it's a fire hose of misinformation that you can't counter all of it. So if you're trying to deal with your responsibility for fact-checking, it's good to have fact-checking out there. It's good to do some of that. You probably feel that there has to be other types of ways of going at misinformation. And sorry, Chris wants to say something.
Can I just add something quickly to that? Yeah, I would say, I wouldn't want you to hear what I think you heard. And I think it's important to think about how we are conceiving and acting on fact-checking and who is doing it. So, for example, Meta stripping fact-checking out of what it does, bad idea, right? We know that kind of moderation works. We know it had good impacts during the COVID and public health crisis. There is definitely a role for it. But if you over-index on it, if you make it the one thing you think you can do, if you make it the solution, I think that's asking journalism to do too much. And I think we need to be more creative and inventive. This is kind of the point I was trying to make about how we develop fact checks to lead people into better stories, into better sources of information. So the information literacy stuff you're talking about, all kinds of techniques out there, those are valuable. But the standard form of fact check where you put up a fact and you have point, counterpoint, I think that has very severe limitations. And I think we have to think well beyond that when we're trying to deal with the wider situation we're dealing with.
Can I add something?
Please do.
Yeah, I just think, as it was being said, that fact-checking is of course important, but it all comes to, are we fighting at equal terms? And when we talk about disinformation, it's so profitable, it's so easily spread, that we need to question as a journalist, well, I'm not a journalist, but I perceive journalists as really important in questioning in which condition we give speech to someone. Are we countering what's being said by an interest representative, by an expert? Are we being sure that the contradiction is very vocal? And are we sure that we need to give speech to everyone, including climate skeptics? Is it really necessary? And those kinds of questions are important when we produce the information in the first place.
All right, do you have another question? I think there's... You want to go ahead?
I'm reminded of a saying that the earth isn't dying, it's being killed. And similarly with journalism, journalism isn't dying, it's being killed. And social media is the murderer. I just wanted to, it seems to me that everyone is trying to make sense of the chaotic reality that we all live in currently, and journalism and what it is supposed to do is make sense of the world for us, yet we are devaluing it more than ever. I am curious to know your thoughts on how journalism evolves from being, I think we talked about this idea of being objective, to now we are living in a media ecosystem where it's very much personality driven. You can listen to Joe Rogan talk about climate disinformation for 3 hours and people will be like, yes, I'm listening to every single word you say while you talk about this graph that makes no sense. That you are getting the exact opposite idea from, that is just completely anti-science. My question is, how do journalists reach that sort of, there's like a parasocial relationship that happens with some of that. And is that the job of journalists? Is that the job of like influencers? Is that the job of platforms? Is that like, should we just give up on social media altogether, burn it down and start from scratch? What do you think?
Well, a lot of our journalism is shared on social media, so I think we better think twice about that. But you want to take a shot?
I was just going to say, yeah, it's something to what you said earlier, how you had to evolve, how you went on TikTok, and I think we need, as journalists, to fill that space where, I mean, unfortunately, we can't do it on Facebook, as you mentioned, but. In Twitter, you mentioned, was a big, I used Twitter exactly to connect with people and scientists and researchers. Now I'm on Blue Sky, but the public really isn't on Blue Sky all that much. But I think it's about evolving and trying to, kind of squeeze yourself in there to get information, accurate information out there in the spaces of social media, because we do share our stories on social media, like you said, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon, I don't think.
Yeah, evolving, yes. One of the things I learned is we did a series of workshops with the Canadian Association of Journalism, trying to think about how we could tell better stories, how we could support journalism better. Those workshops were astonishing to just bring journalists together to hear them talk about this stuff. This is where my big opinions around fact-checking came from, about how we can innovate and do better with that. So I'm just here stealing journalists' work, basically. But what was really interesting about that is the ways in which they are working with this very question. And I think one of the secrets about Canada is, and I don't know if there's any academics left here, and so if you can just put on the earmuffs for a second. When I'm asked where to go for climate communication and where I'm asked to go to learn about energy transition stuff, I say, go read these 20 journalists. Go read their back catalog. We have amazing climate and energy transition journalism in Canada. Really good stuff. It doesn't circulate. It doesn't bridge into these other conversations. I don't think it's their job to do that, frankly. I think it's the job of other partners to figure out how to help them navigate these problems. They're busy doing their job, and there's things we can do to help bridge them into some of these spaces. There's things we can do to help them understand how just different visual content can engage audiences differently, help you learn how TikTok operates. So I think there's ways in which we can take this on as like a civil sector problem and not say, hey, journalist, you have to go do this other thing besides learn how to do audio, video, write a good story, fact check. I mean, and by the way, you're not supported as well as maybe you once were. So I think there's a real role and importance for that if we want this and take on responsibility to do it.
Yeah, and if you watch TikTok, there's a lot of news items there that it's not on a journalist's feed, but they are replaying something they saw through journalists. So there is news being sort of transmogrified through the echo chamber. But that's always been the case. It's just it was a different echo chamber. It happens a lot faster now, right? So Joe Rogan isn't a journalist, but he is part of the he is part of the media landscape, right? He's not doing the same thing that most of these people do.
And what you're saying is interesting, and I think the question is very good. When I was in school, that happened more in French literature than in English. I think in English the classes we had were like very evolved on that topic, but in French they would make you read Richard Martineau, and for those who don't know, who are not from Quebec, he's basically, it's very opinionated. He's a columnist who writes his own opinion. It could be about the sky being blue or whatever, and our teacher would make us read that as journalism. And we were being taught that was journalism and like the only form of journalism. We weren't reading anything else. And that's the thing in where I come from, where I think in the mainstream media, that the confusion is very out there. And like for when I speak to people who are readers or whatever, and they consume the news their own way, they say, well, my lack of trust is the fact that genres have been confused, there's like a thin line in between, and it's hard to decipher whether it's opinion or. And I think we shouldn't be looking down upon opinion, looking down on influencers. Or I think the problem with traditional media is they don't they should open their, their views a bit and be like, okay, well, you know what, this is what people are, this is where
You mean in
people are
terms of
getting-
format?
Yeah, I think maybe we should keep up with what's happening, and if we have to change our medium, if we have to change our ways, maybe adding some more color or tone or persona is not gonna, compromise the quality of the information. It depends, but I mean, let's keep our mind open and see what's being done. We're not necessarily doing it better.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we have to work together, maybe work with people like those on TikTok and see, well, they're getting the information, so maybe work with them and see what we can do.
So journalists have been restricted in their formats until they're sort of pushed along. We used to joke that, you would go out and commit journalism because you would follow this format, rather than telling a story. Next question.
All right. I wanted to piggyback on what you said earlier, Chris, because this is also something we heard from Zoe on a panel earlier on about the fact that local news are disappearing. It's also eroding their communities. And you mentioned that part of the solution is actually focusing on local journalism. And I'm curious, how do we do that, knowing that even with C18, we're not managing to get the big platforms to contribute their fair share of advertising? We had a political party was thinking about stripping down CBC during the election. So when the big players are not even able to stay in the game or are struggling, how do we support local journalism then?
Oh, well, if we had the answer to that. I don't know the economic model for local journalism. Anyone? Because I really don't know. It's been, in Canada, it's now not just, it was local newspapers, now it's local TV, it's
I will say, CBC, we've just branched out to do more local journalism. So there'll be a lot more. It's just started, so.
I mean, part of it, I think, if I can just jump in, is not being cynical about the value of journalism. And I know we're aware of the distrust of it. We're aware of the distrust of media and institutions. And sometimes that distrust is earned. But that is different from the disease of cynicism that I think is baking in around whether journalism can ever be a viable possibility, or even what the profession of journalism does. So there's something there that's kind of cultural that we have to think about and push back upon in the very stories we tell about journalism. But in the context of something like this, where people want to address dis and misinformation and are looking for regulatory solutions, absolutely essential in my view, that are exploring technological solutions, developing an app for better wildfire warning for authentic information. That's one way you can go. But thinking about and understanding how supporting journalism actually helps you with that problem, actually helps you with other problems happening in communities. Local journalism, they don't pull big salaries. Right? Supporting local news, supporting local radio with advertising spends. There's small things that can kind of happen with the resources that we have. Yeah. And I think if civic sector community actors take it upon themselves to try to make the value of that more visible and more present, I think people in those communities would also get on the back of that. I don't know if you would agree, Zoe, that people would lend their voices to that as something they want to see and hear as part of municipalities having more autonomy over their own affairs. So I think that's a very oblique, that's not going to solve the economic case, but I think that might be a way in which you try to just reframe how it is we're talking about journalism in a more expansive way, what its value is, and listening to people that experience it as a loss when those newspapers, radio stations' voices are gone.
But there's a program in Canada dedicated to helping local journalists, which doesn't work for our media because we're not considered, we're a small media, but we're not dedicated to only Montreal or whatever. It's called Independent Journalism Initiative, I think, and it's there are several media outlets that are using it, that qualify for it. So you should know about that for those who want to employ a journalist for a specific area or a local area. You can, get that help, and I think it can cover up to $60,000 for a salary, or $40,000. Maybe it changed, but it's a big step up.
It covers a portion of the salary. I don't remember the details, but most of the news organizations view that as a temporary measure, sort of, the relief measure for the industry while it's struggling, that one day will have to be replaced by some economic model, and most local newspapers or TV stations were owned by private companies that, want an economic model that involves making money at some point. Sorry.
Can I just answer a question as well? Yeah, I just wanted also to add on what's being said. In France, the economic model of local journalism is a lot of public funding. And I think this public funding is, of course, decreasing as everywhere else in the world, basically. But a lot of the answer comes back to the value that we attach to the production of information. And one thing that's striking is, for example, during extreme weather events, the rapid alert systems often have a blind spot, which is media and the quality of information that's being produced. And we refuse this information as also something that could be used in terms of security and defense, which are domains in which public funding is way more spread. And we think, for example, that disinformation campaigns are particularly problematic during extreme weather events. For example, in Valencia, during the recent floods, fake emergency numbers circulated, and including by the local press. And that was problematic because, well, of course, some people didn't have the help that they required. And if we considered information and quality journalism to be something that's critical in terms of public security, maybe it could be helped again, and maybe it could help local journalism to be, well, funded better.
Okay. I think, sorry, you're next.
Great. Thank you for the conversation. I was wondering, we're in a media environment where for just a member of the public online, it can be really hard to know the difference between a journalist and someone who doesn't have the training, who is just putting information out there. So I wanted to get your thoughts on the possibility of some sort of accreditation system, a national accreditation system for journalists to show that they have gone through formal training. And I've heard different opinions on this, so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Nicole, you want to try that? I'm dumping it on you.
So, sorry?
I'm dumping it on you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if we see that happening, but, I would say, and I tell my family this, go to trusted news sources. So the Globe and Mail, the CBC, Global, CTV. Don't go to Bob's, whatever news site. Where I'm seeing a lot of that actually too is on YouTube. Unfortunately, so much misinformation and disinformation out there. But it was funny when I started out, we got accreditation on Twitter. We got verified. We got that blue badge. And, that was supposed to be to let the public know that we were, trusted sources. And obviously we know what happened to the blue check. But I don't know if you could do a national program in order to again, I'd say go to trusted news sources. And that includes climate sources, like Yale 360, for example, in the US, I would always tell people to go to, where you can trust the source.
And if you're motivated and you're not lazy, you go find the institution who actually delivers the press card, and you will find the list of journalists who pay for a subscription and who are considered by the institution full-time journalists verifying the information, not just a blogger.
Those systems of accreditation don't really set standards for professional behavior, and when they've tried to do so, it's really been problematic. Even in the National Press Gallery here, and I was on the board for a little while, and you'd have to do the accreditations on a regular basis. And it's really the only questions that everyone can agree on is, are you on a full-time basis working to cover politics in Parliament? And that was it. It's not professional standards of training or anything like that, and that's partly because of the sort of level of free speech requirements that we
have higher standards in Quebec, maybe. I don't know, but like the FPJQ is very
there as well.
And I love the CBC, and I work with the CBC as well on the radio. But I mean, honestly, the FPJQ, you're careful with what you say or do. If you're loud and you're public and you do something that's out of the lines, you get it. They take it back. And I've seen that a lot.
It's not required to have it. I was a member of the FPJQ. I was accredited at the National Assembly a long time ago, but it's not required to have any professional standards.
I was just going to say, to your point, Chloe, also look up who you're reading. This is, Bob Smith or whatever, and okay, that was way too easy. Like that's way too hard to look up that name. But anyway, you look up and you see where I've come across people who are like, this is, sorry, but I'm going to like throw in chemtrails, okay? They were like, chemtrails, this person told me about chemtrails. And I said, what's this person's background? Oh, I don't know, they're a scientist. I look them up and I'm like, well, their expertise, funny enough, is in social sciences or psychology. And so I said, just take 2 seconds to look them up.
I think also, I think
Did you want to ask a question, sir?
Can you hear me? I'm sorry. I just wanted to add on that. Regarding Reporters Without Borders work, I think it's worth mentioning that they are developing this the Journalism Trust Initiative, which has as a purpose to foster quality journalism on search engines. And at the moment, some European media are certified by this Journalism Trust Initiative, and I see Google agreed to boost the media that are certified on their search engine. So that's also a response to how we can foster the economic model of quality journalism.
I think you had the next question.
Yeah. I was just curious as to the inputs from y'all's end that determine what you cover, So there's the top 10 stories of the day. There's the fact that it's your beat and you have a certain number of reporters that are dedicated to said thing. And when we're talking about trust keeps entering the chat today, right? This idea of building trust. I was just thinking about this. I was like, I have no idea how this stuff, gets decided. I just thought I would take this opportunity to get a bit of a better sense. Do you survey? Do you look up surveys that other people are doing?
No. So for me personally, the whole reason why I became a journalist and decided in university that I wanted to become a science journalist is because curiosity. I wanted to provide people with answers, useful answers that they, that would amaze them. Back when, this is before we were talking so much about climate change, but for me, I read a lot. Studies, for example. I'm not a big study person though, but for example, right now, if you go and look at Climate Reanalyzer, I don't know how many people know that, but there's a site which has, the world's temperature, SSD, like sea surface temperature, et cetera. If you go right now and look at the Pacific, the North Pacific Ocean, it's pretty much on fire. And so that is something I want to write about because, and then there are things like when the fires are around, some questions. And sometimes we get readers who reach out to us who say, hey, we have something called Just Ask. And so readers can send in their questions. And sometimes we say, oh, you know what? This is what people are interested. Let's write about that. That's from my point of view.
So I leave myself aside for a bit, but generally, if you talked about the Political Bureau, the Ottawa Bureau, the Globe and Mail, it kind of works the way news works everywhere in the sense that everybody has sort of areas that they cover and beats. In politics, there's more of a sort of ecosystem that you're always sort of following, but generally speaking, it works where you have an area you generally cover, and in the morning you come in and you say, I think I should write about this, because if you don't, somebody says, we think you should write about that. And so it's a very pitch-driven thing where you better have an idea in the morning, and then somebody says, I like that, I like that, I like that, and maybe you should do this other thing. And so, but it definitely sort of generally follows, the news that you've been covering because you've been working on a beat. I don't know if that helps you understand it, but that's good.
But you were also asking what we do to make sure we
connect with public.
Yeah, and also the question about whether we do interviews or we have dedicated journalists for every single topic. So for me, I don't know for you guys, but I feel like we do have, journalists who are better at writing about cybersecurity. Why? Because they simply have the contacts. And for us, it's super important to write after having interviewed experts. And you'll say, well, how do you choose your expert? Well, obviously, we do like everyone else. We look up at, we have our sources for that, and there's a list. And but it's important to interview as many experts as you can, maybe 2 experts. There's always like 2 sides of a story, obviously. So that's the thing they teach you. That's the narrative I like that they teach you in schools, and that I try to keep as much as possible. And so, yeah, so when I say we need resources, because if I want to pay a freelance journalist for a paper, and I'm also paying for the hours he or she is going to put in the work, that means having 2-3 interviews. Well, I need to have enough funding so that, you know, the quality is there. And when it's not, well, what you get is an opinion piece, basically, or like something that you research on Google or ChatGPT, and they give you the, like, whatever references. We want to go above that and ask the right people, and usually at least 2 experts, and that's what we do to make sure that we come up with the right information.
I just realized I wasn't thinking about part of your question, which is how do you know that you're connecting with your audience? And there is a little bit of market research. I'm sure the CBC does more than we do, actually, but the market research. But there's also a lot of feedback tools now, right? And we have, at the Globe, despite it all, we have a team called the audience team, which is supposed to be trying to figure out what the audience wants, mostly through sort of data feedback. Trust me, there's all kinds of feedback that you get as a journalist, including emails every day, some of which are, you know, worth replying to as well. So, like, people will be sending you things all the time when you're a journalist.
We only have 5 minutes left.
Somebody online, I think, wanted to pose a question. Is that?
So we have 2, actually. Should I ask them both? Okay. So first one says, I've been thinking about Catherine Hayhoe's remarks on activating the head, heart, and hands. The panelists have been talking a lot about facts, which are not enough to motivate climate action. To what extent are there conversations in the larger publications like CBC and the Globe and Mail about crafting narratives that better support people to take climate action?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, that we do solutions-based journalism, and we actually have a newsletter called What on Earth, and that is about, we try positive stories out there, tackling the difficult issues, though. So from CBC, this is what we're trying to do. We, even at one point, we had a, like on Facebook, we had, I'm gonna mess it up, but it was the 3 R's, basically. Again, we kind of changed it, and the public was really engaging with that. But that being said, sometimes I wonder if we're getting through to the right people, right? Or are these people who are already committed to climate action? So I don't know what that answer is, but that's what we are doing at the moment.
I think that question is about science communication and connecting with people, but it's not really the way that we tend at the Globe to look at those stories. We're not, generally speaking, standing around saying, how can we motivate people to act on climate change? I know that you all wish that we did, but we don't. And we don't think that's part of our calling for the most part. Now, there are journalists at the Globe and Mail who are very passionate about climate change, and 1 or 2 of them write about climate change on a regular basis, and you can probably see it in some of their writing. Adam Radwanski writes a lot about climate change, and I would be shocked to find out that he's not passionate about climate change. Never asked him, because we don't do that. We don't ask each other, what do you think about climate change? Because that's not the culture of a newsroom. We don't say, hey, what would you like to do to advance the cause of action on climate change? I don't even know what my colleagues, and we talk about these issues all the time, but I don't know what they think about it. Because we don't think in that way. We don't think, how are we going to move this along? We think, how are we going to move the story along? How is this story progressing? What's happening here? What's the next development? What is news? What's important? How do we explain this to people?
Well, we don't, so I'm
not saying that you do, by the way.
No, I was going to say, that is not how that came about, the solutions journalism. We were responding to feedback from readers and studies that showed you can't be negative. Like I told you, that's kind of what I do, unfortunately, but I talk about the science and the hard science behind it. But that came out of, research that showed that one of the ways to engage is through providing solutions, but we do actually stand around and talk about climate change, but we have a content unit.
So I think what I was trying to address was the hearts part of that, because solutions-based journalism is totally valid and it's a different kind of thing. But the hearts part of that is, and I don't think that I'm arguing against people doing that. I think there should be people doing that on TikTok and in YouTube and in various things, but I don't think that's what we think of as our journalistic mandate.
Can I add one quick point? I think it's just because the facts thing keeps coming up, and I think it's important. I've never met a journalist that says they write facts. They write stories, and stories do that. And stories can be told in a way that makes people feel they're disempowered and don't have a capacity to act in the world and engage with the thing that's described. Or, and this is the thing, the conversation that solutions journalism came out of, which is that when solutions are part of a longer discussion on climate change, it raises people's feelings of self-efficacy, and they feel they can continue the conversation. Doesn't mean that the person making those solutions part of the story is advocating for them. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. So it's more about, do you tell stories that aren't just kind of fact-based, here's the facts, ma'am, sort of approach, but that are relatable and connecting with people's experiences, and you trust them to kind of carry that forward. No journalist, I really think, would be prescribing, some would, I suppose.
Yeah, no, there's been a move against just the facts, ma'am, because it's not really a great storytelling method, but yeah. Did you have one more?
On stories, there's one last question online that says, are there always two sides to a story? That's the kind of reporting that led to climate reporting making it seem like the scientific consensus on climate change wasn't as strong as it was.
They said, sorry, can you repeat just the last part?
So, are there always two sides to a story? That's the kind of reporting that led to climate reporting, making it seem like the scientific consensus on climate change wasn't as strong as it was.
Yeah, see, that's what I was saying back in 2013 where I had that issue. And they actually had me debate our local meteorologist on was climate change anthropogenic. And I was stunned at the time. I was like, what? Here's the thing. Climate change is here. We're seeing it every single day. So what's the other side to that story?
So I agree with that. There isn't two sides to every story. It is built into journalistic training, though.
Yeah.
It is built into the way we function, and we are the basic part of the training is be skeptical of everything everybody tells you and go seek out another point of view.
Yes.
And
so that is built in there. So getting around there are two sides to every story means you need some sort of strong element to push past that, and you don't have to treat. I assume that most journalists don't anymore treat every story as he said, she said. But go.
No, but so very well said. And I mean, and I love the question because earlier I said there are always two sides of the story, and I think thank you for helping me clarify. There are always different angles to a story. I think they can still converge in some way. Let's not do a geometry, but you mean you know what I mean? Basically, even if there's a story, we can go get the story from someone who works in a very different area and who is impacted very differently than somebody else. But I mean, make the effort of finding another voice to give some tribute to. I think that's important. That's we have to work like that.
Last word for Chris.
Yeah, certainly that debate way of framing did impede the way in which people acquired a public understanding of scientific climate science, believing that it was in debate when the scientific community was not in debate. That was a big problem. But I dare say we're in a moment where there's all kinds of energy and extraction stories being told with no climate perspective present. And so no debate in those cases around a very central element of what's going on. So I think that's something where we might want to restore an understanding of debate or multiple perspectives that takes account of a very salient question when we talk about conventional energy.
And we're past time, but Eva, because I've been so terrible in calling on you, I apologize. I'm sure you have something to say about whether there's two sides to this story and how we should tell it.
Well, I completely agree with what's being said. I think the norm of the balance has been creating a huge bias in the way climate science is being portrayed in the news media. And at the moment, this very norm is being used to give, a lot of visibility to people which have interest at heart. So I think, it's central to the problem. And back to the other question, I completely agree that journalism is not only about facts, it's also about emotions. And one example that's being used by this famous French IPCC expert, Valérie Masson-Delmotte, she says that that's crazy that during heat waves, we never talk about who's dying and the families of who's dying. And maybe creating stories about the victims of climate change could also bring emotions back.
All right, well, that's a very good last word, I think. Thank you very much to the panel, and thank you all for listening to us, and thank you, Jennifer.
Well, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. And we started the day talking about fractured narratives, and I think we've ended the day talking about the fractured nature of journalism and communication. It's going to be hard to recapture that optimism that Dr. Hayhoe left us with. But definitely it was a thought-provoking discussion, and thank you so much for your contributions and for the lively debate that ensued. Thank you so much again, Campbell and panels. It was a great discussion. Great way to end the day. Thank you.